Well, this is a small insular group, but hopefully online we've got more people watching, and I now learned from the last moderator, even though I didn't do this earlier, that I'm supposed to say the panel number for our online listeners, 1.14, Countering Extremism in the Ranks. And this is about a legal toolkit for law enforcement. My name is Mary McCord. I am the Executive Director for the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law. We do constitutional impact litigation. We fight against political violence. And I have a background as a federal prosecutor and in national security. What I'm going to do is each time I turn to a new panelist, I'm going to ask them to introduce myself rather than take the time right now to do that, because we are supposed to be trying to end on time. This is really going to be about, extremism in our law enforcement. We've all seen stories. There's been reporting by major news media about the prevalence of extremists within law enforcement. We know that there were some active duty law enforcement who participated in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. ADL, and we have Rachel Greenspan here from ADL, recently issued a report about the number of law enforcement and military veterans who were on a membership list of the Oath Keepers, an extremist militia organization. So we know it exists. But Heidi, I want to turn to you first to just to what extent? I mean, we've got thousands and thousands of law enforcement officers, police, sheriffs, and other type of peace officers. How prevalent is this problem?
Well, I mean, the truth is we don't know, Mary, right? We don't have any concrete evidence to point to. Rachel will talk about the Oath Keepers list. What we have is a ton of anecdotal evidence. So we know that police officers in recent years have been involved in Klan groups, in neo-Nazi groups. This just happened in Springfield, Illinois, that they have been involved in many of the groups that were involved, that were storming the Capitol, the Proud Boys, militia groups. There's a ton of anecdotal evidence along those lines. But there isn't anything that tells you exactly how bad this is. Now, we have so many police officers in this country and so many agencies that it isn't really possible that the problem is it's a massive percentage, right? This is a very unlikely situation. It's, Mary and I were both on a panel related to the constitutional sheriff's movement. There, I think you might have a more substantial number of individuals connected to an anti-government movement among the ranks. But the actual numbers are really unclear. What we do know is that this is a poisonous situation when you have a police officer with extremist ties. It's a danger to the community, it's a danger to morale, it's a danger to the cases that you bring. And the other thing we know is that there's not good policy in a lot of police departments to either root this out or to address this problem. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the landscape that we face. Mm-hmm. And we also don't have any place where any of this is recorded, which I think is also problematic. There isn't like a registry for bad cops on this front that you can look at. And then there's a lot of evidence about sort of when you get into a looser area of like racism, right? Cops in Facebook groups, Border Patrol, et cetera. So we know it exists. The FBI has been complaining about it since 2006 and saying it's a serious threat, an insider threat. But the actual dimensions are a little hard to define.
And, there's an outsized impact, right? 1 or 2 in a force of 300 has a far greater impact than, those other 298 just because of the pervasiveness of the...
Yeah. I had a chief who had to deal with this situation say it was like a drop of poison in a cup of water.
Right.
Right, it spoils, it's deadly to the whole group.
And that's one reason we want to eradicate, and we'll get to that. But before we do, Rachel, talk to us about ADL's new report.
Sure. I'm Rachel Greenspan, ADL's Director of Law Enforcement and Civil Rights. And what we took a look at a few weeks ago, ADL released a report that looked at 38,000 names of individuals who signed up to join the Oath Keepers between 2009 and 2018. And what was really remarkable about the analysis of what my colleagues did for this report was taking a look at where individuals came from in sections of society to potentially sign up and join the Oath Keepers. And what we saw after this analysis were 373 individuals that we believe to be active law enforcement officials around the country. that also included an additional 1,000 names, which we believe were retired members of service in some capacity or fashion. And I think what is really interesting about these pieces of information, other than, of course, data helps us really figure out how to pinpoint where the problem may be, is that some of these individuals self-identified as officers. They said they were police officers, they said they worked in law enforcement, and they spoke to the training or the skill set that they could bring to help the Oath Keepers, and in a way bring the Oath Keepers' messaging to others in law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And so I think what that highlights is the need of all of the things that we're going to be speaking about in terms of providing education to law enforcement, and looking at how to ensure that they understand that groups like these and the Oath Keepers go out of their way to recruit law enforcement, to recruit military and veteran officials, and bring them in to then try to recruit further as they go deeper within the law enforcement community. Mm-hmm. So the report, which is online and you can take a look at on our website, really breaks this down. And as you've all mentioned already, and we all in this room know, one is one too many. And it is an outsized impact because of the fact that if you have an agency that's 3 people, which in many jurisdictions there are smaller agencies, one officer who might be supportive of extremist movements or groups or ideologies like the Oath Keepers is likely to have a much larger impact, negatively potentially, on the community that they are policing. And it gives real legitimate questioning as to whether that officer is going to uphold their oath where they swore to protect and serve everyone, and joining a group like this, being a member, expressing support for extremist movements or ideologies really kind of goes against their oath of office. Mm-hmm. And not kind of, it does go against their oath of office. And I don't know why I couch that. It does go against their oath of office. And that leads to a less safe society, whether you're the community members, you're the public, or you're other members of law enforcement. So I think that this can affect everyone everywhere. And like Heidi mentioned, of course, we're not saying all law enforcement members ascribe to these types of beliefs, but just one member in an organization can really negatively impact the community at large.
Yeah, and this probably by now, with the House Select Committee hearings and lots of headlines, probably everyone knows who the Oath Keepers are. But just 1 second on that. I mean, this is an unlawful private militia. It's a nationwide presence. It's led by a guy named Stuart Rhodes, and they believe in essentially private militias that are military organizations being a bulwark against the tyranny of the government. And so sometimes they ally with the government if they believe and agree with what the government does, and sometimes they forcibly and violently oppose the government, such as the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Their rationale of sort of like being this bulwark against tyranny of a central government is not founded in our country's history. Militias were purely relied on by the governor to be able to be called forth in defense of the state, even at the time of colonies before the founding, never in opposition to the state. They're not protected by the Constitution. The Supreme Court has held that the Second Amendment does not protect them and that states have to be able to regulate them, and all states do. They just don't do it very effectively. So when a police officer joins a group that is essentially an anti-government and insurrectionist group, that is already outside the rule of law that they're sworn to uphold. And that's one reason that it's important that, and I think this is why many of us are up here and have been working to try to educate and inform our law enforcement partners. All of us partner with law enforcement, that they don't have to tolerate this. Oftentimes you will hear, well, First Amendment, our officers have First Amendment rights. They're entitled to their views, even if those views are racist or bigoted or anti-government. But that is actually not the case. The First Amendment, just like the Second Amendment, is not boundless. And the Supreme Court and courts across the country have been clear that there is substantial leeway to actually discipline, including firing or refusing to hire as law enforcement officers, as deputy sheriffs, as peace officers, those who engage in extremist activity. So just a couple of basic legal principles. First of all, when a police officer or any public official is acting in their official capacity, right? They're on the job, they're even off the job, but doing, sometimes they moonlight, you know, as bouncers, and they still wear their uniform. When they are speaking as a police officer, they actually don't have any First Amendment rights. And if they engage in extremist activity, they can be fired, and we don't even worry about the First Amendment. But even when they are speaking in their personal capacity, think off-duty, right? Personal capacity on an issue of public concern, the courts have given substantial leeway for them to be disciplined, again, including firing, when their activity undermines the mission and effectiveness of the agency. So back to Rachel's point, it's hard to imagine something more undermining to the effectiveness of law enforcement than having an officer who is, you know, vocally antagonistic, or worse, expresses, you know, hatred for or violence against any particular grouping within community, whether it's race-based, religion-based, ethnicity-based, gender, sexual orientation, what have you, or anti-government views. How can you have trust with the communities you serve? How can you get people to want to come in and cooperate and report crimes when they've been victimized of crimes or when they've witnessed crimes? How can you have camaraderie within the force? All of those things are legitimate reasons for a law enforcement agency to say, we are taking action to discipline this person or fire this person because that conduct that person is engaged in has impacted negatively our ability to do our job, our trust with the community, our camaraderie within the department. Oftentimes, you know, people of different religions, ethnicities, races in the department can't work with these folks, and you know, and it has undermined our mission, and that is actually, you know, quite clear from the case law. So Katie Reisner and I, her organization, States United Democracy Center, and ICAP have worked together on some guidance that we've put out quite broadly to law enforcement, making these points, but going actually beyond that. So how does that law translate into what are they supposed to do? What are the law enforcement agencies supposed to do to try to ensure an environment where this doesn't happen?
Thanks so much, Mary. And as Mary mentioned, I'm Katie Reisner. I'm a senior counsel at States United. We're a nonpartisan election protection organization, and I run our preventing political violence work. So the appearance of law enforcement officers with associations with extremism is of huge concern to us, not least because we try to really engage law enforcement to ensure that they're a really productive force in protecting our elections. And so if there are folks inside who do have a motivation to undermine elections, that's a big problem for us. So as Mary suggests, you know, there is this kind of fiction out there that the First Amendment is absolute, ironclad, hermetic seal on anything that that government employees do, and that is really just not the case. Law enforcement agencies, government employers generally, and especially law enforcement agencies, have pretty wide latitude to address expressions of extremism, bigotry, hate, especially when they can demonstrate that it will be disruptive to their mission or has been disruptive to their mission already. One really concrete example that I think really drives this home is prosecutors will tell you, like, yeah, man, it's a really big problem if it turns out that a cop is racist, because then I try to put the cop on the stand, and on cross-examination, that evidence about his racist beliefs is going to come up, and it's going to undermine, derail our whole case. And I think that's just one example where you can really see the detriment to the whole mission when one individual has these beliefs and associations. So what can law enforcement agencies do about it? The toolkit is pretty robust, and we had the benefit of talking to former police chiefs, sitting sheriffs about what they do, how they try to ensure that they have tools at their disposal to handle this. So one example really supported by the case law is adopting a social media policy. Courts have upheld really pretty broad social media policies, pretty broad in scope. And this is really effective because it puts employees on notice that their behavior is going to have bearing on their ability to remain employed. And so this has been kind of a helpful sort of upfront warning to folks. Another way to try to ensure that some of these tools are available to folks is through collective bargaining agreements. So whenever police unions go in for their employment contracts, that's a really key time to ensure that some tools are available to management to address extremism, bigotry in the ranks. And then another kind of element is ensuring that these tools are available at every stage of management practice. So when folks are up for promotion, ensuring that they then kind of sign back on to a code of conduct, ensuring that there's a review of their disciplinary record up until that point. These are some of the tools that law enforcement leaders have told us have been effective to them and certainly survive First Amendment scrutiny.
So that's very helpful. And I think one of the things you're getting at too is, I was very just sharp about you can discipline, but officers are entitled to some due process, right? If I'm a police chief, I just can't say, Joe, you're fired because I read your, racist screed last night. They're entitled to some due process, but their opportunity to either say that wasn't me, somebody stole my iPhone and posted that, somebody was posting under a false name, or I have a reason, or what have you. But these social media policies, these value statements, these things up front so that the officer knows the expectation really go a long way when it comes to that due process. So Arusha, I really want to turn to you to talk about the work the Lawyers Committee has done. You guys have been very sort of targeted and involved when you hear about a specific instance. Heidi mentioned a lot of anecdotes of instances of particularly, bad police officers. What does Lawyers Committee do when you learn about that? You've been quite effective.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to my panelists. It's a really important issue. So I'm with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. We kind of got involved in this issue a little bit by happenstance in 2019. Megan Squire, who has been at this conference, reached out to us to alert us that she had discovered that a cop in Connecticut had been making payments on Venmo to Proud Boys elder, and it looked like Proud Boy dues, so Proud Boy members pay dues to their elders. And so we investigated a little bit more, and all the evidence pointed out that this cop was a Proud Boy. So immediately we sat down and wrote a letter. We cited the FBI report Heidi mentioned, as well as Supreme Court case law. And just asked the police chief, we really think you should investigate. The cop admitted to having formerly been a Proud Boy. But the police chief got back to us, said he had received an, quote, explanatory report from the cop, and that he'd looked at a couple months of the cop's arrests and there was no racial discrimination, ignoring kind of the longer history and an excessive force settlement and kind of picking the evidence, it seemed like. And when the AP asked this police chief, what he knew about the police, about the Proud Boys, the chief, said, quote, only what I searched for on the internet. So he didn't talk to Heidi or ADL or any of the experts you would kind of think someone would go to. He just kind of looked on the internet. So then we wrote a second letter because we weren't very happy. There was more media attention, and within a week, the officer had resigned. So that kind of really started our interest in this topic. And unfortunately, the examples keep coming up. So last summer, a college student at Williams College in Massachusetts alerted me that there was a cop in Williamstown, which is a college town, that had a picture of a poster of Hitler up in his work locker, so kind of on-duty conduct of Hitler for about 7 years. And when I say work locker, it looks as if it wasn't like hidden. It seemed as if, colleagues and superiors probably knew this poster was there, and yet nothing had happened. So I worked with this student at Williams College to get in touch with the community members. And it was really striking because my first call with them, they used the word, they said they had raised the issue with the police chief and the city government leaders, and just it hadn't, it had kind of been dismissed. And I remember they used the word gaslit, like they felt gaslighted, like maybe this is normal, like maybe we shouldn't be upset that there's a cop with a poster of Hitler in his locker, is that normal? And so I think they felt really gratified when I came in and pointed out some of the case law Katie was talking about and saying like, no, this is not supposed to be, and there should be some kind of investigation into this. So again, we wrote a letter. our letters kept getting longer as we found more and more case law. So cited Second Circuit case law, Supreme Court, the FBI assessment, as well as about half a dozen of the police department's own policies that had been violated. So talking about social media policies and, well, this case, not social media, but just the other kind of policies and the mission of the department and how this undermined the mission. And also really asking the question, in this case, it was a picture of Hitler, but really asking the question, how is a Jewish resident of Williamstown supposed to feel comfortable calling to report, a swastika on a synagogue or any other hate crime or any crime at all, or provide evidence if they don't know if this guy who has a poster of Hitler in the office is going to take the call? Like, it does not serve the department's mission. And so in that case, the city did take some action, but as far as I know, that officer is still on the force in Williamstown. So, I followed up and they said they didn't think termination would be upheld under Massachusetts law and practice. I asked, what Massachusetts law? I haven't had an answer yet, so that one's still ongoing. And then just kind of
just interrupt you there, and I'll come back to you. This is something that you will hear because law enforcement, they're going to go to their city attorney or their municipal attorney when they want to take action. Their municipal attorney is in a very different job than all of us up here, right? That attorney is trying to protect the city from liability. He does not want to be sued. He does not want to do anything that risks being sued. And so they're not bad people, but they are very cautious. They are very risk averse. And I'm not at all surprised that city attorney told the police chief, oh, under Massachusetts law, we'd be sued. We can't do that. You know what? Call one of us, because one of us would be happy to take that, to put that pressure on and give some different advice to the police chief. So I actually think it sometimes does a real disservice to law enforcement leaders who do want to take action, who are kind of told, oh, we might get sued, figure out something else, put the guy on desk duty, right? Yeah.
And as kind of as a counterexample to those two jurisdictions where they kind of drag their feet, in Fresno last summer or fall, we learned about a Proud Boy cop in Fresno, California, and he had admitted to being a member of the Proud Boys. There was footage of him marching in the Proud Boys colors, yellow and black, and the little kilts they sometimes wear. So he'd been marching with them. Had admitted to being a member. He had also posted on social media a picture of bloody knuckles with the caption, "Rough day at work." So that's great when you're a police officer. Also a picture of himself wearing a Punisher mask, pointing a gun, and the caption on that one, and I apologize for the language, is, quote, "Shit is a lot easier when you can kill people." Again, active officer on the streets of Fresno. And he also tried to make a white officers association in the department. So all very concerning. Understandably, the community members there were like, very upset, also very well organized. Don't mess with community organizers. And they had already done a lot of the groundwork, but we developed a relationship with them, and we came in kind of to give the nerdy legal arguments for why this wasn't okay. Again, kind of citing a bunch of the case law. Katie mentioned Ninth Circuit case law, and again, about half a dozen of the policies that had been violated, this time including the social media policies. And about a week later, the officer, he was fired or resigned. He was fired, I think, and as a footnote, he has now sued the city. So, in that case, the police chief did come out and take action. And kind of the last example I'll give is in 2019 in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I know one of the other panelists yesterday mentioned this. 3 cops forgot to turn off their body cams and recorded themselves saying incredibly racist things. This is in the wake of George Floyd's murder. That body cam recording was discovered as part of a just routine audit. So again, it's kind of tip of the iceberg. You don't know what else is out there. And less than a month later, the police chief, who was brand new, had investigated and fired the 3 officers. And I think it was he fired within like the first week of his job as police chief. And it sent a very clear message, I think, that like this would not be tolerated. And he also worked with the prosecutors to make sure they were reviewing cases and to also make sure they weren't just going to be employed again later. So. Yeah, I think there's a real variety of responses by police chiefs and municipal leaders.
So one of the barriers sometimes also, and this might be some of the problems that municipal attorneys have with supporting firing, is that oftentimes collective bargaining agreements between cities and their police departments have extraordinary protections for police when it comes to discipline. So Rachel, I know ADL put out a very extensive toolkit that it's not open for public consumption, but it's targeted at law enforcement agencies, and it covers some of this. What advice does it give, or do you have for getting around or negotiating different collective bargaining agreements that don't cause those problems?
Yeah, so the toolkit that we worked on for about a year, because we quickly realized that there is not a one-size-fits-all policy that's going to help 18,000 departments all over the country, kind of takes a look at this issue from what I guess you could call a holistic or whole of society, well, within the police ecosystem approach. And it looks at how to potentially craft policies that put your members on notice as to what is prohibited. Because at the end of the day, officers have to understand what they are prohibited from doing. And the better crafted the policies are, the more your officers will understand what related to misconduct related to extremism is not condoned and it will be prohibited. And this toolkit provides some principles and tools for agencies to think about how to deal with this proactively, because the last thing a chief really should want is to have to get up at a podium and have a press conference after finding out, like a Delaware situation or Williamstown, that their officers have been engaging in extremist activity. One of the challenges that we heard when speaking with agencies about this were feeling that unions or collective bargaining agreements were standing a bit in the way of mobilizing from a larger perspective and standing up and saying that this type of behavior does not fall within the category of protecting communities. So I think the toolkit provides some guidance in terms of not only how to think about crafting policies, like Katie mentioned, for social media use, what misconduct looks like related to extremism. It also kind of just discusses the concepts of collective bargaining. There are some states that have something called Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which give actually expanded protections for law enforcement professionals above and beyond what regular collective bargaining agreements or union agreements. And that's not to say unions are bad. So, I don't want to make a statement that means all unions are bad or anything like that. But the reality is sometimes they can be an impediment in enforcing discipline. And discipline and consequence, along with transparency to the community about how you handle these matters, is of paramount importance when we want to try to make sure that we are building trust with communities. So it speaks towards a little bit about working with municipal council, working with outside counsel, and ensuring that you're just thinking about this topic as it relates to bargaining, and as it relates to potential protections, which law enforcement officials do have from an employment perspective, but that it's a balancing test in terms of what's public, what's in the public good, and what behavior falls inside and outside parameters of misconduct that really need to be outlined at the outset. And just another thing I want to add is that the toolkit also speaks to an education component. We talk a lot here, and many of us know because we've been here and we, have seen news articles or in our professional lives read about groups like the Oath Keepers. But when we analyzed the Oath Keeper list and we reached out to the affected agencies that had the names that we believed were officers, we contacted every agency that we believed was affected to bring this to their attention and to say, this is a problem. Here's some information. Many of them did not reply. Many replied and said, thank you, we'll take a look. And some got back to us and said, who are the Oath Keepers? Or they said, we kind of know a little bit about them, but we're not really sure. And so, at least from our perspective, we were able to help and provide that resource. But to not have the law enforcement agencies understand the gravity of who this group is and their direct targeting of law enforcement and military and veteran is deeply problematic. And so the toolkit speaks to suggestions of how to educate your law enforcement officers so that they are in a better position to understand the signs and the symbols and indicators of what extremism looks like within the law enforcement community and what it looks like to potentially be recruited by these groups. Mm-hmm. because then those officers have their own toolkit to be able to make the decision and say, oh, this group is not who they claim to be. They are not coming to me asking to stand up and uphold the Constitution. This is a manipulation of the way that they perceive that they'd like to view the world through their eyes of the Constitution, which is not legal and not reality. And so, I think giving your members really like additional resources, in addition to all the policies and considering all of the legal implications, really kind of holistically helps everyone at every level from executive leadership down, because also, as mentioned, it starts with leadership. It starts with chiefs and leaders saying, this is not acceptable. We do not condone this behavior here, and we will call this out when this is happening, and we will deal with it and be transparent about it to make sure our community knows that we will not let this behavior continue here.
So that brings up two questions for me. One, and I want to state them first so that I don't forget them both. One is about training and more training for police officers, or police departments, which raises two problems related to advising them about this and then also who's doing the training. But before we get there, Katie, we've talked, a bunch of these examples have been about membership in an extremist organization, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, etc. When you and I talked earlier about sort of the First Amendment rules here and how courts will evaluate discipline for extremist activity, even in one's personal capacity, not as a police officer, even on a matter of public concern, how does membership or even alliance or affiliation in an extremist group fit in to the First Amendment case law that's out there that does allow for disciplining for extremist activity? I think the classic cases are cases that involve speech. Somebody on social media or saying something or overheard on their body cam, making racist statements, anti-government statements, anti-other statements. And there we look at, is it on an issue of public concern, or was it just something like, courts have held that if you're just, and this is a real example, wearing blackface for fun, you're not even expressing a message. It's not even a matter of public concern, and you have no First Amendment right there. But when it is on a matter of public concern and First Amendment is implicated, we know that if it undermines the mission, that speech, it can be disciplined. What about membership in the organization? Let's say the person can't find anything on his social media that shows that he said anything, but he's a card-carrying member, if there is such a thing, of the Proud Boys.
Right. Yeah, that guy paying the dues in Bitcoin or whatever. Maybe he got a card for that.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Mary. And I think that this is one of the questions that we're presented with squarely, not least because of the ADL's work and other work like it to really identify folks who may in fact be members, but may not have undertaken other concerning behavior. So as Mary mentioned, membership in one of these organizations, the Oath Keepers, 3%ers, Proud Boys, that would probably be determined by a court to be an expression of First Amendment activity that is a matter of public concern, which is to say conduct that is commenting on a social issue, a matter that concerns all of us, a matter of perhaps news significance. And so then the question under this test would be, what impact does that membership have on the mission of the law enforcement agency? And this is where law enforcement agencies have an opportunity to document either prospectively or in retrospect what impact this individual's membership in this organization has had or will have on their mission. So, for example, the law enforcement agency can be documenting incidents of communities reporting to the law enforcement agency that trust is down because of this individual's membership. The law enforcement agency could document, look, we've had something like this happen before, so we're concerned that moving forward, now that we know this individual is a member, we are concerned about harmony within the ranks. We're concerned about morale of other officers. We're concerned about this individual's ability to work as a team with other officers. And so that documenting practice will put the law enforcement agency in good stead when, should they arrive in court at some later point in time after having undertaken disciplinary action or even termination. So even in this case example, which you can kind of think of as perhaps even a knife edge case, there are still tools available to the law enforcement agency.
Yeah, I mean, assume in the jurisdiction maybe there's even been a Proud Boys march, and you could imagine right then saying how divisive that's been for the community. We can't have one of our officers participating in that. So now I want to come back to the other part of that question. I think, Rachel, you made raised a really good point about law enforcement departments. First of all, I think maybe might have been not completely upfront to you when they said they don't know anything about the Oath Keepers. Just saying, they weren't under oath when they said that, I don't think. But so putting aside being disingenuous, and I'm going to look to you on this, Heidi. What kind of resources or what do you think ought to be happening? Because this is about deliverables in terms of creating a resource for law enforcement. Now, never mind SPLC, where you used to be, and ADL both have extensive online resources identifying different extremist groups, but what beyond that might be useful? And then also, what about the problem of current training in law enforcement, where we know there's almost no state regulation, and pretty much any former law enforcement official can put out a shingle and say, I do law enforcement training, and potentially get a contract with a jurisdiction to provide that training, and that trainer himself might be a member of the Proud Boys.
Well, I mean, on the first part of the question, if I'm remembering them correctly, yeah. I mean, I do think I think some of the people who responded to Rachel probably were telling the truth that they didn't know anything. Mm-hmm. Definitely not all of them, as you pointed out. And I think there's actually a whole lot of education that needs to happen for cops across the nation about the nature of extremist movements. There's a high level of ignorance. And frankly, the federal government did not teach courses on domestic terrorism starting in about 2001 at FLETC and all the way until very recently. Hate crimes training also was quite not uniform. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of them that wouldn't know what was going on, and that actually needs to happen.
FLETC is Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and that would only apply to federal law enforcement, non-DOJ.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, then I think about all the academies,
exactly.
Right? And why don't the state level academies and sometimes they're regional and whatnot? They should be teaching at least a mini course about what is the FBI considers the #1 threat to the United States, right? So it seems to make sense. Yep. So that's one piece of it, and the other piece on the training is I just feel like post standards have to be upped. The people who make it, I have a class where I teach about extremists in law enforcement, and we're going through California's post process, and it's intense, and I'm not complaining about that. It should be is this useful? Mm-hmm. What's the this whole process?
Post is peace officer
standards and training, and each state basically has a post operation. And they need to be educated about extremism because they have given certification to terrible things in the past, anti-Muslim stuff, constitutional sheriffs, and many more. And then actually oftentimes with post, if you're post certified, the feds might be paying for you to take the class from the bad guy. So post needs to understand and be more serious about the certification process. And really, police departments shouldn't be willy-nilly going out and hiring people to do training that don't have legitimate credentials. And this is a different aspect of the same problem. And there's just an incredible lack of information about all these things at all these levels. I've also seen in some jurisdictions, insurance companies that insure cities and insure police departments are expressing concerns about how post functions in some places and the payouts they have to give, for various kinds of abuse. And it's another avenue, perhaps, to address these issues.
Always another avenue, get to the bottom line dollar, right? And that's very useful. So I did not bring up the little iPad I was supposed to bring up to take audience questions, sorry, but we're not a big group. So if you have a question, just throw your hand up and you can ask it and I'll repeat it for the live streamers. Tom.
Yeah, so what is the nature of FLETC training on this?
So the question is, what is the nature of FLETC training on this right now? I don't. Maybe you do, Heidi. I will tell you, though, that I, within the last 3 or 4 months, had a conversation with someone in the Forest Service who had to go through the FLETC training and reported to me that even though this wouldn't be seen in any of the written curriculum, one of the instructors there was pretty openly anti-government, conveying through the course of the training, election denial and, that whole thing, which I dutifully reported to those who I thought I should report that to. And that's deeply troubling, right? Because this is another problem where, the curriculum that you might put forward to be approved might look very different than what the trainer actually says. But Heidi, do you know more about the training? Or anybody here?
Yeah,
really?
well, Rachel might know better than I. Unfortunately, I do remember as I was leaving the Law Center in 2019, early 2020, that there was discussion about reviving what used to be a week-long domestic terrorism class where SPLC people and ADL people used to teach. It was a long time ago. Not about, there used to be a week-long hate crimes. I don't think that's been revived. Whether this has actually happened or not, I'm unsure.
Others. Barbara.
Mary, I'm curious, I have a two-part question. One, I know when we did the militia work that one of the ways that you helped to get the word out was you sent the letters out to both law enforcement, then you also alerted media. And so my first part of my question is the decline of local media a problem in this area, and are your organizations kind of filling that void? That's one. And then my second question is, and it came up from another panel, I'm not aware, to what extent maybe should the civil rights organizations be alerting insurance companies along the way, hey, look, we've got this officer over here, by the way, he's outraged, or we put the police agency on notice, and now the insurance agency is on notice as well, something like that.
Yeah. So the question was essentially, what do we do to, all of us at various times have written letters out to law enforcement to advise them of different things. In my case, it's often been militia activity. In Arish's case, it's been this extremism in law enforcement. And oftentimes it gets press coverage. And to what extent, is the decline of sort of local journalism impacting that? I will also say that the guidance that Heidi's organization, States United Democracy Center, and ICAP, my organization, jointly put out, unlike ADL's, which is sort of specifically targeted for law enforcement and not a generally publicly available document, our document is generally publicly available, and we sent it widely, including to journalists, so that they can cover this better, so that they won't just say, oh, First Amendment protected, okay, police chief says I can't do anything, so that they'll have that other voice, because some journalists, I was a journalism major, I love journalism, are lazy and don't go get the other voice. And so that's really important. On the insurance, it's a great thought. I hadn't done that before. I'm wondering if Lawyers Committee has alerted insurance companies in the instances of the cases that you've been
We
involved.
haven't, but we've been toying with that idea. I think it's really right, but I think there was a Washington Post article recently on that point. And I can tell you, we had I've had lawsuits where it just feels like there's a disincentive to do the right thing, because if you're suing someone in their official capacity, the insurance company covers the cost. So why would you settle? Why would you do the right thing if it's someone else's money? So I think you're absolutely right. It's follow the money. The insurance companies need to know that there is a real risk there. And I think there was some of the researchers who were on this track's panel yesterday talking about okay, so it's just social media. But that is linked to real world potential harm, and then the insurance company is covering that. So I would not want to be in the insurance industry covering a Proud Boy cop or an Oath Keeper. That is not a gamble I would take.
It really seems like something they ought to be talking about when they write their policies, frankly, because that could really change the incentives. I think we do have maybe time for one more. Do you still have a question? Yeah. Oh my God.
Is there something any of you can do to observe this? He's a very successful seminar business, training local police departments. I tried to find out if he's trained anyone in our area, and I can't find out.
So the question involves, and what's his name? I don't.
Lieutenant Colonel Dave
Dave Grossman, a lieutenant colonel who does police trainings, but it's basically on killing people, and says some pretty awful things like you will have the best sex of your life the day after you kill somebody. That shouldn't be part of any police training curriculum, just full out. And, back to this comment about lack of regulation, post that Heidi was talking about, that's not, I don't think in most states that means it's required that you be certified. That's just a voluntary certification thing, right? So people, including the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, will go, and sometimes even they have gotten certified by Post, showing how ineffective Post might be, to do trainings. But you don't have to have that certification if you can get some local police department to hire you. And this is where it does feel like there's a big gap, and I think maybe one of our deliverables, as we were talking about earlier today, is, perhaps even tie some federal DOJ money that goes to law enforcement around the country to making sure their training that they're engaging in is, legit by people who are not extremists and not telling people to kill other people. I mean, some very basic things here. We don't, but of course that means coming up with a more standardized curriculum that would then be policed. So that's, not just an easy bit of business, it's a big bit of business. But it seems like, we started in a way backwards, talking about bad cops on the force, but some of that can be traced back to training and recruiting. Who are they out recruiting? Who are they trying to get to join the first force? So bigger problem than we can fix in the 45 minutes we were given in order to get back on time. And I appreciate everybody coming in, and I think all of us stand ready to talk offline and answer additional questions you might have. So give it up for the panel.